If you're looking to create nice half-blind dovetails in some thin stock, like 12mm, for a fine box or some drawers, you'd have to be an absolute mad person to try and cut these by hand. It would just take you forever. I do not think it would be worth it. But you can do it fairly effectively in a dovetail jig like this, using a 5/16 dovetail half-blind template. So this is one of the smaller templates. There is a larger half-blind template, which we actually already demonstrated, so there'll be a link to that above. It also goes into the whole process in much more detail. So if this is your first time watching anything about this jig, check that one out first. To use this jig, you're gonna need a specific router bit. It's a dovetail bit. It's got a 7.9mm diameter and a 9-degree angle. All of that information is listed on the packet, and we'll also link to that product below. Okay. Now, as with all of the videos we've done for these jigs, there are 4 key steps. The first step is to get the clamps in the position so that they will firmly grab the timber. So that's just a matter of adjusting the height of those clamps. The second step is to adjust the position of the horizontal and the vertical timber position stops. And I'll explain exactly where to put them. When they're in position, then you can adjust the position of this comb. And then the fourth thing is going to be adjusting the height of your router bit. Now we'll go through with some fairly specific measurements which all relate to using 12mm timber. If your timber is a little bit thinner or a little bit thicker, I'll give you some details on how to figure out which way you need to push those measurements to tweak them to get really good results. So, start out by getting your clamps in position. I don't need to go into any more detail about that, just make sure they're nice and firm. Second thing, we're going to adjust this horizontal stop on the top face here. Now the way we're going to do that is you're going to mark a center line in your piece of timber. You're going to slide that in and position that center line exactly in the middle of a trough. Okay, now when you've got that lined up in the middle of a trough, you want to make sure that it's square, and then you want to bring that stop up and tighten it off with your screwdriver. Now, do that action again on the opposite side, but it's going to be a mirror image. Now we're ready to set the position of the vertical timber position stop. Now, this also needs to be square to the body of the jig, obviously, and it needs to be 5.6mm across from the horizontal position. Now, the reason for this is 5.6mm is the distance from the center of one trough to the center of one finger on the comb. Now, I don't know exactly why it's set up that way, but that just seems to be exactly what works. The easiest way I've found to get this measurement is get yourself a 5.5 or a 5.6mm drill bit, loosen off the top clamp, place it next to the horizontal stop, then push your timber up against that drill bit. Now that has moved your top timber piece exactly 5.6mm over. Place your vertical piece into the jig so that it lines up exactly with those, with that top piece. Clamp it off, make sure it's square, and then move that vertical stop over to that timber. That'll mean it's in exactly the right position. Obviously, when you're going to run the cuts, remove the drill bit, put the top piece back across to that jig. Like I said, they need to be 5.6mm apart from each other. The next thing we have to do is set the position of the comb. Now, this will differ depending on how thick the timber is that you're using. But for this 12mm timber I'm using, I've found that the comb needs to be behind the front face of the timber by about 3.7mm. If you're using a different thickness of timber, start at that position, and then you're going to have to go one way or another depending on what kind of timber you're using. The best way to line this up is set yourself, 3.7 on a little set square or something like that, or a spacer, and check the left side and check the right side and tighten it off that way. Make sure it's even along the whole face. So the last setting we need to make is the height of this router bit. You'll notice for this I'm using my Triton with a Milescraft Turnlock baseplate. This allows me to use one of these 5/16 bushes over that router bit, and that is what is going to guide me through this jig here. So you have to use a 5/16, which means you can't use a bearing or anything, just you have to get one of these bushing sets. Now there are other bushing sets available, just has to be 5/16. The height of the bit from the base plate needs to be about 14.5 millimeters. Now, I'm not sure exactly why that is, it just needs to be that much for the angle on this particular bit. So start at 14.5, and then I'll talk about those adjustments to make sure it's tighter or looser if you need to later. So that's set off, lock off the height on your router, place your timber into the jig so that it is all up against the guides and really nice and flush. For this demonstration, I'm just going to be doing one set of joins instead of both, but once you get this all set up and you've mirror imaged your guides on the left and the right, you can do 2 sets at once. What I like to do to set these up is bring the vertical piece up so it can act as a stop for the top piece, which I can then bring hard up against that, lock it into place, and then I can readjust the vertical one if I need to, so that it's really nice and square and flush with my top piece. Both of those are locked in, I'm ready to cut. So, first test cut. Put it together. It's pretty good. A few things I can improve on. Now, this is how you go about it. First thing to look at, is the joint too tight or too loose, okay? If it's too tight and you're having a really hard time getting it in there at all, what you need to do is actually reduce the bit exposure or reduce the bit height, pull the bit into the machine. If the joint is too loose, you need to expose more bit or make the bit longer. Only by a fraction, but that's the steps for that. In my case, that's not a problem. Okay, the second thing to think about is have the two edges actually lined up. If they haven't, you need to figure out which way you need to go, and you'll move your vertical stop one way or another to accommodate for that, so that you can get that really nice and flush. The third thing you might need to figure out is, like I have here, my pins are not going deep enough into the grooves in the carcass here. So what I need to actually do in this case, because they're not going deep enough, is increase the depth of my comb. So, not deep enough here, push the comb back a little bit. If these pins are going too far into the wood, move the comb forward towards you a tiny bit. So the only change I need to do is to push my comb back just a fraction. It's actually, you need to move it back by half the distance of this error. So this is about a 1 millimeter error. I only have to move it back by about half a millimeter. So then I'm going to retest cut, hopefully have a perfect joint then, and then we'll be good to go. Okay, that got it pretty close. It could still go in a hair more, but apart from that, it's all looking perfect. I mean, that's the process. You do some test cuts, you go through that checklist and you make adjustments as you need, and then you will get a really good product. Once you've done that setup, you don't need to do it again, and you can just work through all of the drawers or all of the boxes that you're doing, and they'll all be right. So now you just got to do your set out, figure out where you want these joints, whether you want the decorative face forward or whether you want it on the side, and just work through all of your pieces of timber that way. So it's a really strong joint, looks beautiful. Like I said, you'd have to be a bit nuts to try and do this by hand, although all power to you if that is what you want to do. But I don't have time for that personally. Like literally, I do not have the time. Anyway, this has been fairly easy to use. There are plenty of other templates you can use on this jig to create other joins, box joins, through dovetails, and we have other videos on them, so check them out as well. You can pick this up at Timbecon. There's a link below where you can, it'll have a link to the product, And otherwise, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and there'll be a few more videos coming up on this particular jig in the future.